Welcome, Professor Kimball.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Let me just open my screen sharing. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Pamela. I assume you all have my presentation in front of you, my slideshow. So higher education has historically enjoyed great public esteem in the United States. But over the last 4 decades, that opinion has shifted to resentment, due in large part to the seeming paradox that tuition and student debt have risen rapidly, while fundraising never stops and endowments grow ever larger, particularly at the wealthiest colleges and universities. Over the next 50 minutes, I will explain the genesis of that paradox while drawing on the book that I have co-authored with Sarah Iler, who earned her PhD with me at Ohio State. We focus on the nonprofit sector of American higher education, which now includes about 3,300 colleges and universities. To understand this complicated history, it is important to clarify at the outset our definitions of key terms. Wealth, as we use it, denotes the permanent invested capital or endowment of colleges and universities. Cost means the expense that schools pay to produce the education, which is often called production cost. Price denotes the tuition and academic fees charged to or paid by students for their education at colleges and universities. While adopting those key terms, our book divides the historical arc of 150 years into 2 broad periods: the formative era and the golden ages. The formative era, covers the decades from 1870 to 1930 and is defined by the introduction of now familiar kinds of institutions such as research universities, land-grant universities, HBCUs, women's colleges, graduate schools, and community colleges. The formative era is also defined by the invention of new modes of fundraising. Finally, it was in the formative era that leaders of major universities began to conceive their pursuit of academic excellence and reputation as a Darwinian competition to survive and succeed, as University of Chicago President William Harper and many others stated. Following the interim decades of the 1930s and 1940s, the era of golden ages covers the period from 1950 to the present, and is defined by the advent of aggressive investment strategies for endowment portfolios, along with the infusion of large federal grants and contracts. Also by the increasing concern and complaint about the growing production cost, then the rising price and debt of students, and finally the widening wealth stratification in higher education. Within that chronological framework, I have organized this lecture by 3 successive topics. First, wealth and revenue. Second, production cost. Third, price and debt. Turning first to wealth and revenue in the formative era, I begin with the emergence of endowment. Today, the term endowment conventionally denotes funds that are held permanently and invested to produce a perpetual source of income. Consequently, this invested capital was usually called permanent funds or productive funds through the 1910s, because permanence and productivity are its primary attributes. Only in the 1920s did consensus emerge on naming this invested capital endowment. Due to those attributes, endowment is a great benefit to a college or university and is considered an important measure of academic quality, as shown by the endless ranked lists of endowments published in the popular press. The first appeared in 1970 in the Chronicle of Higher Education, more than 50 years ago. All of these well-known aspects of endowment today arose in the formative era between 1870 and 1930. The increasing size of endowment was fueled by the tremendous growth in the nation's economy, starting in the 1870s. In that growing economy, entrepreneurs and industrialists amassed enormous wealth, and many, such as Ezra Cornell, Johns Hopkins, and Leland Stanford, founded or endowed certain colleges and universities with large amounts of invested capital. Here in the cartoon of 1898 is President Harper relishing the philanthropy that John D. Rockefeller bestowed on the University of Chicago, his favorite. Drawing on such gifts, 9 private universities accumulated the largest amounts of invested capital and composed the first tier of institutional wealth during the formative era. Large endowment increased the autonomy of these colleges and universities because other kinds of revenue, such as tuition, gifts, grants, contracts, and government appropriations, are unreliable and depend on outsiders' decisions. As the consensus on meaning and terminology emerged, the amount of endowment funds continued to grow. This slide shows the second tier of largest endowments that emerged by 1930. These top 2 tiers comprise the wealthiest 3% of degree-granting colleges and universities during the 1920s, and almost all remain in the top 3% today. These schools achieved certain advantages in the competition for wealth that ensured their position, as I will discuss shortly. Returning to the first tier, the largest endowment of the decennial year is shaded in this slide. Note that it was only in 1920 that Harvard attained the lead that has continued through today, a century later. Furthermore, each of the other 8 universities in this first tier received a major gift from a benefactor that was several times larger than Harvard's biggest gift. Without receiving such mega gifts, Harvard's endowment attained a lead by 1920 that it has never relinquished. How is that possible? Rather than banking enormous gifts, Harvard built its wealth prior to 1930 by adhering to a new coherent strategy of financial management. This strategy was formulated by Harvard President Charles Eliot over the 40 years of his administration from 1869 to 1909. In 1906, Eliot summarized his view quintessentially in these words, and we named Eliot's approach his free money strategy, which is the next topic in my discussion of wealth and revenue. This free money strategy eventually became the common sense, the prevailing ideology of how to survive and succeed in the fierce competition among colleges and universities. Free money strategy comprised several tenets, which Eliot published in his speeches and 39 annual reports. The first and foundational precept held that a university's rank in the competition for academic accomplishment and reputation will be determined primarily by its wealth. Second, Eliot equated a university's wealth with its endowment or invested capital, not the size of its campus, faculty, library, or budget. The third tenet of Eliot's strategy was that endowment should be free or unrestricted in purpose. Fourth, Eliot maintained that a university should spend all of its income and run a deficit every year. Any surplus could be deposited in the endowment in order to create the deficit. Eliot's reason was that a university's deficit demonstrated its need for more revenue and endowment. An important corollary is that a university's needs are insatiable. Meanwhile, as Eliot was formulating his free money strategy, a new mode of fundraising was invented. This was the annual alumni appeal that Yale College created in the 1890s. Over the next 40 years, the alumni fund proliferated in higher education. For example, Virginia State University was the first fully state-supported four-year institution of higher education for African Americans. In the 1920s, Virginia State established an annual alumni fund and created an alumni association with paid staff under the leadership of President John M. Gandy. At the same time, the innovation was spreading westward. In 1927, the president of the Ohio State Alumni Association encouraged the university president to launch an annual alumni appeal while adverting to the appeal of the University of Michigan. The annual alumni fund thus proliferated throughout higher education. Meanwhile, the national multi-year fundraising drive run by paid staff arose in higher education. Women's colleges had initiated such efforts in 1910, as shown by Wellesley College President Ellen Pendleton here in 1915. Extending those initiatives, Harvard alumni launched the first full-fledged national drive in 1915. This famous Harvard Endowment Fund campaign was reported and publicized by hundreds of newspapers across the country. The campaign adopted Eliot's quotation about free money as its motto and disseminated Eliot's strategy across the country. The annual Alumni Fund drive, invented in the 1890s, and the national multi-year fundraising drive, introduced in the 1910s, supplemented the third mode of fundraising, which was to appeal quietly and discreetly to wealthy donors. The HBCUs at the time found this third mode more successful than the new widespread public appeals to white America. Often these HBCUs formed musical groups that toured the country seeking support for their schools from wealthy donors. This slide shows the Fisk University Jubilee Singers in England on their way to Windsor Castle for a private audience with the King and Queen to sing and seek funding for Fisk. Together, these three modes created the fundraising triad that became widely adopted by 1930 and that has persisted subsequently in higher education. During the interim period of the 1930s and 1940s, fundraising in the three modes naturally abated. Then in the 1950s and 1960s, fundraising resumed as the American economy grew rapidly and the gross domestic product doubled in size. This prosperity during these 2 decades fueled the first of the so-called golden ages of American higher education. Revenue poured in from several sources. First, students and families had more money to spend on college, and the average annual tuition income at nonprofit colleges and universities about doubled in constant dollars. Second, state governments had more tax revenue, and their annual appropriations for higher education also nearly doubled in constant dollars. Third, mammoth federal grants and contracts flooded into higher education for the first time. But those three sources were unreliable, as Charles Eliot had warned, and did not contribute to building endowments in higher education. The increase of invested capital during the 1950s and 1960s came from 2 other sources. On the one hand, fundraising in the three modes expanded. For example, the United Negro College Fund initiated national campaigns. Overall, annual donations to higher education increased by 150% during the 1950s and 1960s. On the other hand, endowments increased due to the soaring stock market and to novel approaches to investment strategy, which became known as portfolio management. During the 1800s and first half of the 1900s, portfolio management was very conservative. Endowments were invested primarily in fixed income securities, such as bonds and mortgages. Stocks or equities constituted at most 15% of endowment portfolios. In 1951, the treasurer of Harvard University introduced a new aggressive approach to portfolio management, which came to be known as the 60-40 rule, investing 60% in stocks and 40% in fixed income securities. This now common approach for even personal portfolios was considered radical and risky in the 1950s. Only a few of the wealthiest colleges and universities dared to assume the risk and adopt it. Their large endowments then grew at a faster rate than smaller endowments during the 1950s and 1960s. The 1970s brought a decade of stagflation, that is, stagnant growth and steep inflation, somewhat like we're experiencing today. Nevertheless, starting in 1970, the Ford Foundation promoted an even more aggressive approach to portfolio management, which came to be known as total return. In contrast to the 60-40 rule, which involved investing in stocks in blue chip companies, large blue chip companies, total return encouraged investment in small companies and foreign companies that had greater capacity for growth and return on investment. Here again, only well-endowed schools dared to adopt this riskier total return investing, while less endowed schools and most public and land-grant universities refrained. The third development in aggressive portfolio management came in the 1990s, when so-called alternative assets were introduced by Yale University. This extremely aggressive approach involved investing in hedge funds, private equity, and natural resources. Once again, only a few of the wealthiest schools initially invested in these volatile alternative assets, while less endowed schools, state universities, and land-grant universities refrained. This slide reveals the slow but steady adoption of investing in alternative assets over the past 30 years. Overall, the three innovations in portfolio management yielded unprecedented returns of endowment income. The annual returns on endowments often rode a frightening roller coaster of volatility due to the more aggressive investing strategies, as shown on this slide of average returns between 1980 and 2007. Nevertheless, the returns for schools that could weather the volatility were extraordinary. Over the 4 decades between 1974 to 2014, the mean of the average annual return of endowments was nearly 12%. This was the best 40 years of portfolio performance in the history of American higher education up to that point. It was yet another golden age. These three innovations in portfolio management therefore combined with the fundraising triad to form 6 modes of building wealth that became conventional over the 20th century. The downside of this financial success was that nonprofit higher education became increasingly stratified by wealth. By the year 2020, just 1/5 of the nonprofit colleges and universities owned nearly 99% of endowment in higher education. The wealthiest 3% owned 80% of the endowment, and the richest 1% owned more than half. During the preceding 120 years, this stunning wealth gap and persistent lead of the richest schools developed due to what Sarah Iler and I call the wealth advantages of the rich colleges and universities. The first advantage was simply that wealthy schools began to have more rich alumni who make large gifts and bequests. In the early 21st century, each additional increment of $100 million of endowment is associated with an additional $2 million in annual donations. Second, compounding that advantage, wealthy schools spent less per dollar raised than do less endowed schools. Third, wealthy schools had greater access to financial expertise, because their trustees had ties to leading financiers, as scholars already observed in the 1920s. Fourth, rich schools could afford to hire those financiers who achieve higher returns, but also charge high commissions for their portfolio management. Fifth, only the schools with large endowments could afford the risk or volatility of investing in the new aggressive portfolio strategies after 1950, which yielded the highest returns. Sixth, although the wealthiest schools assumed great risk to reap the highest returns, they maintained very conservative rules that limited the spending of their endowment income. The residual unspent income was plowed back into their invested capital, which grew faster. This low spending rate is a critical reason why the largest endowments grow faster than smaller endowments. Finally, if the wealthiest schools stumbled, they could issue low-cost bonds to cover current obligations until their risky assets and investments recovered their value, like the $2.5 billion in bonds that Harvard issued during the Great Recession of 2008-2009. Less endowed schools, particularly HBCUs, found it harder to issue such bonds and paid more in underwriting fees to do so. Here was another reason why less endowed schools could not afford the risk to invest aggressively. All these factors constitute the wealth advantages of the richest schools, we argue. I will return to this point, but now I wish to address production cost. During the formative era, the US economy grew faster than ever before, and the gross national product rose more than 700% in constant dollars, as seen in the bottom red row of this table. Over the same period, the aggregate production operating cost of higher education grew more than 4,000% in constant dollars. And the aggregate capital of higher education, including endowment and all property, grew almost 2,000%. These increases in aggregate cost are astonishing. They mean that the aggregate cost of higher education escalated much faster than the national income during a period of unprecedented economic growth. Thus, the United States made a stupendous investment in higher education during the formative period. Such growth in the aggregate cost of higher education is usually salutary for the nation. A democratic society benefits when more people are educated at a higher level. Furthermore, increasing people's intellectual capital makes them more productive and generates more wealth for society as a whole. However, a serious problem may arise if the aggregate cost of higher education grows faster than the economy or the cost of living over a sustained period of time, as happened during the formative period. This trend is called cost escalation and means that higher education is consuming an increasing fraction of the national income, as is the case and the problem with healthcare today. Nevertheless, aggregate cost escalation may be justified in higher education if enrollment is expanding, because educating more students costs more money. Therefore, per student cost is the critical issue that economists, sociologists, and other scholars have focused on. But per student cost is hard to measure across higher education for a number of reasons. Nevertheless, our study of the formative era found that the per student production cost did not escalate. As you can see in the bottom red row of this table, that cost rose 27% in constant dollars, which was a little more than the 17% rise in the price of commodities in constant dollars. Meanwhile, the first blue row of the table shows that in 1875, a year of college consumed the per capita national income of more than 3 people. And the bottom red row of this table shows that in 1930, a year of college consumed the per capita national income of about one person. So why did per student production cost become relatively cheaper, given that aggregate cost increased so much? The fundamental reason was simply that the number of students exploded. Between 1875 and 1930, the total number of colleges and universities more than doubled, and the number of their regular students rose over 13 times. During the next 2 decades of the 1930s and 1940s, per student production cost significantly declined, as seen in this slide. It was in the 1950s and 1960s that per student production cost began to rise steeply. In this first golden age, tuition income, state appropriations, and federal grants and contracts increased dramatically. And this additional revenue fueled the increased spending per student. As a result, during this first golden age, both the aggregate cost and per student cost of higher education increased much faster than the national income or the cost of living. During the 1960s, this dramatic cost escalation prompted many scholars to study the alarming trend. The most influential study appeared in 1968, when William Bowen, an economist at Princeton, published what came to be considered the orthodox interpretation of historical per student production cost. William Bowen, who later became the president of Princeton and the Mellon Foundation, relied on the elegant economic theory of cost disease. The scope of this lecture does not permit me to unpack the cost disease analysis of William Bowen as we do in the book. But it is important to note that he relied on incomplete data from 3 unrepresentative universities, and he focused narrowly on the production cost directly devoted to instruction. This graph presents his findings, which lead to his fundamental conclusions. William Bowen concluded that the per student production cost of higher education had escalated since the start of the 20th century and even since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Furthermore, he concluded that cost escalation in higher education was, in his words, inexorable and unpreventable, because it resulted from the intrinsic nature of the higher education industry. Finally, William Bowen thus absolved higher education leaders of responsibility for its escalating production cost. A decade later, in 1980, another economist named Howard Bowen, no relation to William Bowen, proposed a different, often misunderstood theoretical explanation that also became famous. Howard Bowen, who was formerly the president of Grinnell College and the University of Iowa, examined the broad expenses of colleges and universities. His analysis, which we clarify and name the revenue cost theory, famously maintained that colleges and universities seek and spend all the revenue they can get. Thus, leaders in higher education act like leaders of all charitable, ecclesiastical, and social service organizations, Howard Bowen said. Altruistically, they believe that the needs of their organizations are infinite because additional revenue can always be put to good use. But intense competition for prestige and influence also drive the insatiable need, Howard Bowen said. Furthermore, colleges and universities, particularly the wealthiest, spend less and less of their additional revenue on instruction, maintained Howard Bowen. Much of this non-instructional spending reflects an administrative bias, he said. This bias increases the fraction of revenue spent on staff and administration as the total revenue grows. Directors, deans, vice presidents, and their assistants multiply. Overall, Howard Bowen's revenue cost theory placed responsibility for the rising production cost squarely on higher education leaders. in contrast to William Bowen's exculpatory cost disease analysis. In addition, Howard Bowen showed that financial data do not support the cost disease theory. Drawing on large data sets that William Bowen had not consulted, Howard Bowen showed that per student production cost actually declined during the 1930s, 1940s, and 1970s. In addition, our own study of the formative era found that the per student production cost held steady with the cost of living between 1875 and 1930, as discussed earlier. Over the century, from 1875 to 1980, per student cost escalation occurred only in the 2 decades of the golden age before William Bowen's 1968 study. Therefore, financial data do not support William Bowen's cost disease conclusion that higher education cost escalates inexorably. Nevertheless, in the 1980s, per student production costs began to escalate again, as it had during the 1950s and 1960s. In the 1980s, that cost rose about 2.5% annually above inflation, according to one study. Then in 1995, changes in accounting rules made it increasingly difficult to analyze production cost over time or over between the public and private sectors of higher education. Nevertheless, it was clear that per student production costs continued to escalate in the 1990s. Then, in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, the per student production cost of public colleges and universities grew 73% in constant dollars, and the cost of private colleges and universities rose 28% in constant dollars. The question of how to explain this cost escalation, therefore, remains central. And a marked shift in scholars' analyses occurred concurrently, as our history reveals. During the 1980s and 1990s, as well as in the 1960s and 1970s, most scholars of higher education finance endorsed William Bowen's exculpatory cost disease theory and neglected Howard Bowen's revenue cost theory. Then in the late 1990s, a few economists, particularly David Brenneman, announced that Howard Bowen's view was a credible alternative. Over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, many scholars continued to invoke William Bowen's cost disease theory deferentially, while they simultaneously neglected the theory in their actual analyses. At the same time, paradoxically, scholars increasingly adopted tenets of the revenue cost theory of Howard Bowen, whom they often did not cite. This paradox occurred in part because William Bowen's 1968 cost disease study was not subjected to close scrutiny until 2016, when significant flaws were identified. Conversely, some economists did not consider Howard Bowen's view a legitimate theory because it attributed cost growth to the intentions and motivations of higher education leaders, which could not be tested empirically, it was said. Our history validates Howard Bowen's revenue cost theory by revealing the origin of this thinking in the free money strategy of Charles Eliot at Harvard in the late 19th century, and by explaining the historical proliferation of this strategy subsequently. Our history also reveals that the public attitude toward higher education shifted significantly after the 1970s. During the century from the 1870s to the 1970s, Eliot's free money strategy was highly beneficial, and higher education was highly esteemed, and its cost escalation was considered justified. In the 1970s, experts such as Martin Troe at Berkeley and David Reisman at Harvard considered American higher education to be the best in the world. But in the 1980s, the insatiable need for money ignited criticism, which has devolved into resentment over the last 4 decades. To understand this widespread shift in attitude, we must turn now to examine price and debt. As noted in the introduction, the cost that schools incur to produce education is distinct from the price that students pay for that education. And price is often misunderstood in higher education because the approach of business is usually taken for granted. In business, price is set by adding a markup to the production cost, but nonprofit higher education has never taken that approach. For the past 150 years, the price charged to or paid by students has covered less than half, and often merely a third of the production cost of higher education. The other 2/3 of the production cost has been paid by different kinds of subsidies. In addition, price is misunderstood because the subsidies vary across the level and sector of higher education and depend on economic, political, and social factors. Price thus has varied adventitiously and idiosyncratically, and production cost is the more determinate and fundamental issue that can be studied and explained. Nevertheless, it is clear that through most of the formative era, the price remained relatively low and steady. Tuition at public colleges and universities generally amounted to less than half of the annual earnings of an unskilled worker, and about a quarter of the earnings of a school teacher. One reason for the low, steady tuition was that public colleges and universities feared alienating state legislatures, which made appropriations reluctantly. At the same time, private schools hesitated to raise their price, partly due to a charitable impulse, but also in order to remain competitive with the relatively low prices in the public sector. For example, both Johns Hopkins and Stanford universities did not charge any tuition at all in the first decade after they were founded. Indeed, many private and public schools across the country did not raise their tuition at all during the entire 4 decades from 1875 to 1915. Excuse me. Then in the 1920s, tuition increased significantly. This was a new phenomenon that caused some controversy, but the increases were justified by high inflation. During the 1930s and 1940s, tuition held steady as colleges and universities simply tried to fill their seats until the benefits of the GI Bill kicked in the late 1940s. It was during the first golden age of the 1950s and 1960s that tuition began to escalate above the cost of living, but few complaints were heard due to widespread prosperity at the time. Then during the stagflation of the 1970s, tuition started to become controversial because colleges and universities began to hike tuition and other fees dramatically. These tuition hikes were made in order to compensate for inflation in the school's production costs and for the declining value of their various subsidies. Meanwhile, however, middle-class incomes were actually growing faster than the price of attending college. Higher education was therefore seen as the victim, not the villain. Nevertheless, the 1970s initiated the controversy about tuition that has continued subsequently. Excuse me. And why did tuition, that is price, keep rising steadily after 1980? The fundamental reason, we argue, lies in a turning point in the American economy during the 1970s. After a century of unprecedented, robust expansion, American economic growth started to slow during the 1970s. And subsequently, the growth rate remains relatively sluggish, except for a few brief periods. This slower growth led to rising prices, in part because government subsidies to higher education began to shrink proportionally after 1980. Due to this proportional decline in government subsidies, colleges and universities had to raise tuition and fees to cover the shortfall, particularly public colleges and universities, which were most impacted. The burden of paying the production cost at public schools therefore shifted from taxpayers to individual students in the last 4 decades. Meanwhile, the slowing economic growth also dragged on private colleges and universities, which had always engaged more intensely in the competition to increase their spending and wealth. Even so, the private schools had deliberately moderated tuition increases prior to 1970. Then the dramatic tuition hikes during the stagflation of the 1970s revealed something new. It seemed that the wealthiest elite private schools could charge virtually any price they wish. Whatever Princeton or Stanford name as tuition, there will be excellent students from families willing to pay it. And in order to compete, private schools with less prestige and resources were forced to raise their tuition. Thus, in higher education, it is widely understood that the wealthiest elite schools drive the tuition escalation. This creates an insidious problem for the less endowed and less elite private schools. The tuition published by colleges and universities is their list price, as seen in the middle column on this slide. Historically, through the 1960s, most students paid the entire relatively low list price from their savings, loans, or part-time work. Some students did pay a lower price because they received funded grant aid, such as endowed scholarships or GI benefits. This funded grant aid reduced the amount that students had to pay. This lower price is the net price paid by students, which is the list price minus the grant aid, as seen in the right-hand column of this slide. During the 1970s, most students still paid the list price across higher education, while some students paid a lower net price due to receiving grant aid. But another new factor emerged during the 1970s. In order to compete with wealthier schools, some less wealthy private colleges began to discount tuition by cutting their list price for certain students in order to encourage them to enroll. This reduction in list price for certain students was different than providing them with granted aid that was funded. Discounting meant reducing the tuition revenue received by the school, as seen in the third and fourth columns of this slide. Then, in the decades after 1980, tuition discounting accelerated rapidly at most private colleges and universities as they competed to recruit students. For these schools, the discounts meant lost revenue. However, the wealthiest elite schools did not have to discount because they could fund the entire difference between their list price and net price, that is, the entire grant aid. Colleges and universities are naturally reluctant to divulge how much they discount, and less than a quarter of the private nonprofits report that amount even today, while discounting at public schools is murky and little studied or reported. Nevertheless, it is known that by 2009, undergraduates were paying only about 45% of the average list price at private colleges and universities, which do most of the discounting. Here arises another wealth advantage of the richest elite schools. They drive the increases in this list price, which are widely publicized and stoke public resentment. And they receive all the revenue for the list price that they charge because they can afford to provide funded grant aid instead of discounts. Meanwhile, less endowed schools have been replicating the list price while receiving proportionately less and less revenue because they are supplying more and more discounts. Student discounting and the proportional shrinking of government subsidies created a perfect storm for most of the 3,300 colleges and universities in recent decades. List price rose rapidly, which inflamed public anger. But the average net price paid by undergraduates across higher education remained level between 2006 and 2020. So net tuition revenue did not increase for most four-year schools. Then came the monster wave of student debt, which grew to about $1.6 trillion or more today. Why did student debt grow if the net price held steady? Federal policy on educational loans certainly facilitated and encouraged borrowing by students in general, as historian John Thalen has explained. But these policies do not explain why undergraduates choose to assume burdensome debt that they would struggle to repay. To address this question, it is important to distinguish the different kinds of students who owe debt. As seen in the top bar of this chart, about half of the debt is owed by graduate students, including those in medical, law, or business school. About another quarter of the debt is owed by undergraduates who attended often predatory for-profit colleges and universities. These students generally owe the largest amounts of debt, as seen in this table. They also have the highest default rates, as seen in the bottom row. It is also important to distinguish students with debt in socioeconomic terms. This slide reveals that students with more debt come from the lower three quintiles of household income in the nation, especially the bottom 20%. In other words, students from middle class or working class families hold most of the debt, and their burdensome debt threatens the democratic benefits of higher education mentioned at the outset. Our focus is on undergraduates at nonprofit schools who owe burdensome debt. A major reason for this burdensome debt is neither the rising list price nor the net price, which has remained level for the past 14 years. Rather, these undergraduates have to pay for ancillary expenses apart from tuition and academic fees. And those expenses, food, housing, travel, books, clothing, and so forth, have risen with the cost of living, which has grown faster than the wages and salaries of middle class and working class families over the last 4 decades. This growing shortfall could not be covered by their colleges because these undergraduates with burdensome debt attended colleges that had fewer resources to assist their students. As a result, students had to borrow more. In sum, we argue that undergraduates attending nonprofit schools assumed burdensome debt over the last 4 decades, not due to publicized hikes in the list price of tuition, but because ancillary expenses rose with the cost of living, and their household income of wages and salaries lagged behind the cost of living. And the schools they attended have little or no endowment. While the revenue of the public colleges has declined due to proportionally shrinking public subsidies, and the revenue of private colleges has declined proportionally due to tuition discounting. At this point, I will conclude with a few brief comments tying the issue of student debt back to wealth and revenue. First, our history shows that wealth stratification in higher education has persisted over the last 120 years and has widened significantly since 1950, especially since 1980. Also, when schools reach the upper tiers, they generally maintain that position due to the wealth advantages enjoyed by those in the upper tiers. Second, the wealth stratification in higher education has exceeded and now parallels the wealth inequality or concentration in the nation. In the bottom row of this table, you can see that the percentages of household capital and endowment are now about equal. Third, we argue that this parallel exists because both the wealth stratification in higher education and the national wealth inequality derive from similar interrelated wealth advantages. Above all, the most significant advantage is that income from aggressively invested capital increases faster than the cost of living and faster than salaries and wages of the working and middle classes. This advantage has increased during the past 40 years, while income growth has slowed. Finally, we propose that the shared advantage contributes to burdensome debt for students whose households rely on wages and salaries and have little invested capital, and who attend colleges in the bottom 80% with little or no endowment. Let me restate this closing point because Sarah, Iler, and I have been misunderstood in this regard. We are not saying that the wealthiest schools cause burdensome student debt. We are saying that undergraduates who lack the advantage of invested capital and who attend schools without the advantage of invested capital have had to assume debt that they struggle to repay. And that concludes my lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. I'd like to start with a question. What does then cause the burdensome student debt? Why are these students put in the position where they cannot? They have to struggle to repay it. I know that when I went to school, I could finance my school by working. That's not possible any longer.
That's right. Well, as I said in the lecture, the argument is that wages and salaries of the middle class and working class have lagged behind the cost of the behind inflation and the cost of living over the past 4 decades. And they, the colleges that these students have attended are in the bottom 80% that have no substantial invested capital. So those schools have less resources to help these students. We're not talking, these students by and large who attend the upper 3% or even the top 20% of colleges and universities are not the ones who have the burdensome debt, are burdened with debt that they cannot repay. It's the students in the bottom who attended colleges in the bottom 80%.
And
well, let me just, okay.
what do you propose would be a solution to that problem?
That's what everyone asks me. And that's going to be my next book. I've actually struggled to answer that question, and I tend to fumble a bit. But I do think the fundamental issue that conclusion and a problem, maybe the first thing is to address the problem, is that wealthy universities have been acting like successful capitalist entities in a capitalist system. Okay, and that was highly beneficial for higher education through the 1970s, and therefore beneficial for the nation. But then that strategy or approach had decreasing returns in terms of their public esteem for these schools. But they are perseverating in this behavior in recent decades. And they celebrate this perseverating this behavior. So what do you do? I mean, you're going to dismantle the capitalist system. I don't think that's going to happen, and I'm not sure it's entirely desirable. But I would say that I think the leaders of the wealthiest elite universities need to create a different kind of financial paradigm for their institutions, just as was done 120 years ago. They created a new financial paradigm that was highly successful. And the problem is continuing down the path of the financial approach that they have today, as both Charles Eliot and Howard Bowen talked about, is creating increasing resentment, public resentment, which is manifested by the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act of the Republicans. I mean, there was of course partisan politics behind that. There's a populist revolution against elites that feed into that. But passing that punitive, what I'm talking about is the punitive excise tax on endowment income of the top 30 wealthiest universities in the country, is destructive to higher education and those institutions, I would say. I'm going on too long, so I'll let others chime in. I guess.
Julie.
Hi there, unmuting. Thanks
Hi.
for taking my question. Thanks for your remarks. I really appreciate this explanation of the history of the institutional attitudes about wealth management. And something that came to mind when you were talking about the 70s is Robert Putnam's recent book, which was also co-authored with a former graduate student of his, I believe, called The Upswing. And I think he looks at sort of bigger changes in culture and society as it lines up with policy and well-being for different socioeconomic groups. And since the 70s, we have seen a relative decline for many groups in America. But when you look back from that golden era through to the 70s, there was a lot of great social progress happening and attitude about the public good. And so I think this idea of the inequality being just about the wealth management is true, however, also aligned with a shift in overall attitude about what is the role of government, what is the purpose of education, should it be a public good?
Thank you, Julie. I think it's really well said. I haven't seen Robert Putnam's book, and I'll have to run it down, and I appreciate you saying that. And I would certainly concur that there are larger social and political forces. Without having read Putnam's book, that kind of book often lends itself to sort of general connections between, so you get these large cultural social forces, and then this happened over here, and you kind of wonder, well, okay, but how did those forces actually get there? So this history that I've just laid out is nowhere written down. So we were really trying to identify the actual mechanics, if you will, of how this actually worked, which is not at all to deny that there are larger social forces here.
Sure.
And we, I mean, you know, I've of course talked about 1980s. Of course, that was Ronald Reagan's presidency. And David Stockman was his budget director, and Stockman said specifically, commensurate with this change in public funding, public appropriations for higher education, Stockman says at one point, you know, young Americans have opportunity to attend higher education, and it's their responsibility to figure it out for themselves, how to get there. I mean, he said something of those words. So there was a policy shift that resided on larger political sorts of issues. So again, I concur entirely with what you say. I wouldn't deny that at all. the task in this book was to really try to set forth a data-driven sort of mechanical explanation for how this actually happened, which I think others can certainly build on, hopefully will.
Yes, I think it's a really helpful and important data analysis that you have performed. So thank you so much for that work.
You know, if I can just
I'll
say,
step aside for somebody else.
but actually, if I just follow, you know, this
Mhm.
this little table I showed you of the correlation between wealth concentration in the country and wealth stratification, higher education.
Pretty much mirror images.
What? Yeah, well, actually,
Mirror images.
and we have a larger table in the book. But I'm actually let me tell you the story behind the table. I'm actually kind of proud of it because I've never seen people, I know many people are talking about wealth concentration in the population, and wealth stratification, higher education is well known. I've never seen where the two, I've studied a lot of this stuff, and I've never seen where those two data are actually brought together. And one day, Sarah and Iler and I just thought, oh, wouldn't it be fun to see how the higher education concentration, wealth concentration measures up against the wealth concentration in the population. And so we computed those ourselves. And it was kind of, you know, all of a sudden like, whoa, wow, we didn't expect that. It's even worse in higher education. And of course, we have all the people in higher education are critiquing the wealth concentration in the American population, but in higher education itself.
A la Thomas Piketty.
Yeah.
Well, very good. Thank you so much for taking my question. I will pause for someone else.
Paul?
Yeah, you point out that a good portion of the problem stems lately not so much from tuition alone, or even primarily, but rather from ancillary costs, which are incurred in large part because colleges are still residential. But increasingly, that's not so true as it used to be. There are MOOCs and other forms of higher education delivered through the internet, which, granted, you know, are probably not 100% of certainly not the experience that one has at a residential college or university, but the sitting in a lecture hall with 500 other kids, and the professor is this little tiny person on the stage whom you can hardly see, is not necessarily any better than taking a course online. So I'm wondering, to the extent to which the ROI, if you will, of paying that kind of price to go to an expensive school is really going to be worth it in the next few years, next decade, let's say. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, the issue of online education actually is something that William Bowen explored a lot, because I didn't go into cost of these analysis, but the thumbnail description is that faculty compensation drives the cost of higher education. And so to get around that, all kinds of suggestions were made to kind of have more online instruction. And parenthetically, I might just say, meanwhile, of course, adjunct instructors are being exploited. So that's actually driving down faculty compensation. But the cost of these theorists never looked at that. So there's a great irony there. Okay, but I would say that it just hasn't, first of all, the online instruction has not really proliferated that far in higher education, number one. Number two is that the wealthiest elite institutions, by and large, maintain, and I guess, frankly, I would endorse this, that in-person education with a low student faculty ratio is still much preferable for education than online education. So to the extent that online education is going to be a solution, if you will, to some of these issues, it could lead to a bifurcation, an even greater bifurcation in higher education between the wealthiest elite schools that can afford to provide the the in-person education and subsidize the residential education. A third factor, it just occurs to me, is the ancillary expenses that you mentioned. Of course, it's often argued, and I know you all know that these ancillary expenses have been driven up by the competition among colleges to provide palatial residences and salad bars and everything else, and Olympic swimming pools and fantastic recreation facilities. So it's still this competition among the elites that drives this, because if as an elite institution, you have got to have a palatial recreation center that matches the others, like all the New England colleges have, and the Big Ten universities have. So that's driving it too, even apart from the online part. But that's a great point. Thank you very much.
We have an excellent question from Paul Baskin, who asked me to ask it, which is, what's the underlying reason that large numbers of political conservatives see U.S. higher education as their enemy?
Well, I have a sort of a cynical interpretation of that. Because I don't think, you look at the U.S. Supreme Court, which is now conservative, and 8 of the 9 justices, or actually all 9 justices, including Notre Dame, Amy Coney Barrett, it's up there, number 10, all came from wealthy schools. So many of the elite conservative politicians came from these schools as well. So I interpret that cynically. The senator from Iowa there is I forget his name, was the big one between, he's been lambasting.
Grassley.
Yeah, Grassler. Yes. Yeah. But anyway, I think it's driven by the populist politics, the partisan politics that are supporting the right wing of the Republican Party. If not to offend anyone here, but that's how I would interpret it. I don't credit it. I have a cynical interpretation of that. I don't think that the bulk of conservative politicians, apart from political reasons, actually are not supporters of elite, wealthy higher education. They came from those institutions, I would say.
Yeah, but it is true that college-educated voters tend to vote Democratic.
Right. Yes. Well, I didn't want to go to yes. I'm sort of saying that I'm saying these conservative politicians, right, are supported by the deplorables, right?
Well, only because they tend to vote Democratic only because they have no other choice. The people who represent populist, progressive actions are not allowed in either party.
Okay, well, there's a couple other comments here. Michael Klein. Hi, Mike. Is he still here?
Congratulations, Bruce. I look forward to reading the book.
Oh, thank you. So, and you had a question, Mike.
You kind of addressed it, and Chuck Grassley's name has just been invoked. But I'm wondering historically if there's been investigations by Congress into when they don't like what they see in higher ed. If you give a broader historical view of, there's
sure. Well, McCarthyism. Of course, there's been books written about, McCarthyism and all. But actually, frankly, to my point, I think, of course, McCarthyism was not, to my knowledge, at all about finances. So it's quite telling that the TCJA Act in 2017 was it was a punitive act aimed at the endowments of the wealthiest colleges and universities. And, that's sort of telling about, or it goes to my thesis, if you will, that it's these financial practices that are alienating public and politicians. And politicians are making hay out of it.
Right. If I can keep the microphone for just another second, and to be really wonky, but there's Bill Bennett has his hypothesis that tuition is driven by the availability of federal financial aid. Do your numbers bear that out? Do you have any credence to the Bennett hypothesis?
As that slide I had about federal policies, if you dug into that, I mean, there is, right, okay, there is a correlation, I would say, but that's not a causal, right? That's different from a causal explanation. I mean, it allowed people to borrow. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone to college, maybe. That would be the outcome. Okay, so that would be, but it wasn't causing them to borrow. They didn't borrow, because of the availability of the aid, I would say. And that was part of my argument here.
But if they couldn't go to college without borrowing it, then what do you mean they weren't forced to borrow? They chose to because they had no other choice. How is that a choice?
Well,
They couldn't have gone to college without borrowing it.
right, Pamela, the question was whether the federal, as I understood it, I may have been incorrect. The question was whether the federal policies sort of caused students to borrow more. That's kind of the, maybe.
Well, I think Bennett was talking specifically about Pell Grants, and if
Right, yes,
know that Pell Grants are going to be more and more available, they're going to jack up the price in some cynical, as you say, correlative way.
Right.
If we had some method of allowing earned experience and self-education through the internet or through experience to be accredited through, say, testing, would that not create a competition to the traditional methods of college that might give another route to accredited academic achievement for people?
Yes, it very well might.
So that you could get your certificate that allowed you to be a teacher or a therapist or any other number of things that it's possible to study on your own without paying massive tuitions to large institutions.
Point taken.
And do you think public college should be free?
Well, I think there's a good argument for at least community college to be free. One of the arguments I think that's very powerful that I don't see mentioned a lot in this whole debate is the advance of educational attainment from the beginning of the 20th century to today. In other words, the educational attainment, high school completion rate in the early 20th century, in the early 1900s, the first decade, it was about 15% of the age cohort. And now it's much higher. So educational attainment has increased much higher. So effectively, community college is not even as much of an educational attainment as high school completion was at the early 20th century. That in and of itself, it seems to me, is a compelling reason for funding community college, just as public high schools were funded, which was the development of public school systems early in the 20th century was an innovation as well. Paul Jameson.
Yes, I wanted to ask if you had given any thought to how the European system compares with the American system. I understand in Europe that university education is essentially pretty much free to students.
Yes, that's true. I haven't studied that very much. I do know that David Reisman at Harvard was one of my mentors in graduate school. And he believed very strongly, as did Martin Troe at Berkeley, that a great strength of American higher education was the diversity of the kinds of institutions. So having a strong public sector and having a strong private sector was very important. Having four-year liberal arts colleges that were eminent was very important, as well as research universities. And that having all these different kinds of institutions made a much stronger system overall. So I tend to favor that kind of a very diverse system. And I think that, well, frankly, institutions are competing with each other and have to innovate. I don't think that centralized systems such as Japan, where I studied for higher education for a year, has a very, Mumbusho is a very central higher education agency, or some other continental systems, I think Germany, where, the higher education system is all laid out. It's very much usually exam oriented. I don't think they are as, least attractive to me as an American, but I was brought up here,
Thank you.
So I think the diversity has a great strength of American higher education.
Well, what about just the idea that living in Boston or New York or a number of other places is extremely expensive? I mean, we have a lot of schools concentrated in the area, but it gets more and more difficult to actually live, find a place to sleep and eat and, go from place to place in the city while you're getting an education. But eventually, if these schools don't manage to make some kinds of financial adjustments, they may go out of business because some percentage of people won't be able to afford those kinds of costs while they're going to school. I think the same thing is discussed with businesses. I mean, you can have a business in Boston, but if none of your people can afford to live in the area, you're going to move your business somewhere else.
Not to Silicon Valley.
Yeah. Well, yes, that's true. And of course, there are many liberal arts colleges are struggling to survive these days. And we hear about them, traditional liberal arts colleges closing up right around here. So, I mean, I think your point about the local living expenses is well taken. I was actually, it's funny, I'm just kind of segueing off that, but I'm now retired, but I taught at Ohio State. I moved to Ohio State in 2007 after having spent most of my career at private, fairly wealthy elite institutions. And it's another world out there. I was struck by how people out there around the Big Ten universities, they don't know about this world in New England. They don't know the difference between Colby and Bowdoin, or Wellesley and Wesleyan, it's like, and we think, I mean, so, and that was quite refreshing, because you think here, I think in New England, you tend to think, oh, we're at the epitome of higher education. And then you find out that there are these amazing, flagship state universities where people do amazing work. So I don't know. Scott, yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Bruce, for a talk that I think takes some time to digest. I'm just going to try to work this a little bit of thinking through that I had. Now, if I understand one graph earlier, 1,500 are private undergraduate institutions, 700 are public. Yes? Did I remember that correctly?
Say that again.
1,500 there are 1,500 plus or minus private undergraduate institutions, and about 700, plus or minus public institutions.
Yeah, the public institutions are about half as there are half as many as private
Of
institutions.
course, they are probably the vast majority of the students, but nevertheless,
Exactly,
um,
exactly.
okay, so then if the proposition is to supply community college with free tuition, and generally speaking, community college provides the first 2 years of a, it provides an associate's degree, yes, but
Right.
from the standpoint of the four-year institutions, which hope to get all these people transferring into them, they provide 2 years of the four-year degree.
Yes.
So then I suppose that if community college were made tuition free, why wouldn't we be making both the first 2 years of private institutions, including the elites, and the first 2 years of public institutions free as well, so that the competitive field would more or less remain the same? And wouldn't that then, on the hypothesis, the Elliott hypothesis, just be more constant? It would be actually a lessening of competition, and it would be more feeding into all institutions, which just want more revenues.
So it's kind of you're Scott, you're pushing me down the slippery slope here, I think.
Yeah, I am, but I mean, I think it's mapped out in the.
Yeah.
Okay?
Well, I think two things. I guess I'm not so concerned. I hadn't actually thought this is a very intriguing point you're making. It seems to me that, first of all, many students who go to community colleges for 2 years go there just with that goal in mind.
That's fair.
So we're talking about I don't know, whatever fraction it is of those students who sort of plan to transfer when they go there. And I know in Ohio, actually at Ohio State, there many students do go to community colleges with the idea then they want to transfer to Ohio State to avoid the higher tuition at Ohio State, for example. But I think that's a fraction. And I also think, secondly, that a lot of students want a 4-year experience at one institution. So the
You think it's worth it for them to pay that? A different way of putting this.
yeah.
A different way of putting this, Bruce. One other thing. General education is taught, not the majority of general education is taught by our community colleges. It's not taught
Yes.
by the total of our undergraduate colleges.
Yes.
So if we pay for all that, for free.
Well, okay. Yeah, I'm not sure how that point fits in, but what I was going to continue to say was that 4-year colleges, of course, would prefer to have students for 4 years. So they are going to try to recruit students for 4 years. And so that's another factor that would kind of slow the slip down the slope.
Okay.
What
Okay.
kind of society puts financial barriers in front of higher education? Isn't that disadvantageous to the entire society? Should we forget about colleges competing with each other for students and think about what is best for the students in the society, which is the most education that can be had for the least cost for the most people? Because if we want to get rid of inequality, the way we do it is getting rid of inequality of opportunity, because we'll never get rid of inequality of outcome. That's not possible. But inequality of opportunity, we could easily get rid of, couldn't we? Why are we talking about what we should charge when we should instead be talking about how do we educate everybody as much as possible?
Does everybody need to be educated in a college or university?
I didn't
Because
say how,
everybody
I said
who's
educated.
18, you know, et cetera.
Educated, period, as much as they can take. And that includes trade schools. That includes the nursing certificates and the various medical technology positions that are all over the place now, but that people can barely afford. Most people cannot afford. The ones that want to do it can't afford it. When we have such huge economic inequality, then that makes for a huge disadvantage, inequality of opportunity to learn.
And it increases the disadvantage, it increases the gap.
Exactly. It's a self-perpetuating problem.
And it decreases it's the upward mobility. In some ways, the United States, I think, was formed to be a society where, you know, very poor or disadvantaged people could become advantaged people if they worked hard. And this is getting harder. And this doesn't help.
Well, you know, we had socialism under FDR with the New Deal, which caused, with the supports, the greatest period of prosperity the world has ever seen. And that included the Marshall Plan, where we paid to rebuild Europe after World War II. And we didn't talk about, can we afford to do this? We just did it. That kind of social spending is an investment that pays off much better than the endowments of the colleges do. Not just for the country that does it, but for humanity as a whole. Thank you, Arvind. I see that little heart. But why do we have such sort of academic resistance towards socialized public goods like education, spending on education, spending on healthcare, spending on unconditional basic income that would wipe out poverty at a very low cost?
Why do
Or
you think it,
decarbonizing the energy supply.
Pamela,
Yes.
why do you think we would be able to wipe out poverty at a very low cost?
Because if you give everybody money, that does it. It doesn't get rid of misery, and people will mess up always, but you get rid of institutionalized poverty.
Certainly the recent, when they ended the child credit,
Tax credits.
yes, the poverty among children increased immediately and greatly. So obviously just putting money into that one sector of the population decreased poverty.
When they cut free lunch at public schools, that had a direct impact on the poverty of children in America.
Yeah.
But I think one of the elephants in the room we're not talking about when it comes to this question of like, should people go to college or not? It's not just should they go to college or not. Why have we been selling this idea of going to college? Is because the alternative in America is to be poor and imprisoned or dead.
Not
And
sure that's true.
that's not very feasible or tangible
Not
for
sure
a lot of
that's-
people, but it's true.
I'm just not sure that's true. Now, I do think that trades are a viable alternative. Whether there's sufficient trade opportunities, over a period of time is a question. But the question that would also be raised, are there really job opportunities after getting out of college? So that kind of, all I'm asking is, are there other alternatives than directly going to a college or a university that might provide realistic opportunities for people that they might be able to afford to take? I mean, the argument is, in a way, I think that college is getting unaffordable. That's been the basic argument.
And I would say, let me just piggyback there, Scott. I mean, there's a lot of writing out there now precisely on this topic, that college is getting so unaffordable, and going for apprenticeship or entering a trade is a much better way. In fact, I've been astonished. I have colleagues and friends who went to eminent institutions, and they've talked to me about, it doesn't seem like you'd even want to necessarily encourage kids to go to college anymore, unless they're going to some of the elites, because it's not the brass ring that it has been for 120 years. And this is another outgrowth of the resentment prompted by the financial issues.
But don't you think it's also an outgrowth of the opportunity to get the education through other means too? No longer is the only way you can get it by going to college.
Well,
The
the availability of trade schools and apprenticeships has been around for a long, long time.
But that,
It's just that college has been regarded as the preferred and road to elite status. And
in Massachusetts trade schools, many of the best students go to four-year colleges instead of entering the trades. They go on to engineering and technical schools to a high degree. But it has actually been documented that divestment from public education is correlated with increase in prison populations in America. That has been studied quite extensively for the past 30 to 40 years. There's a body of literature on this topic. And so that is part of why I bring this up, not to speak without conviction on that question. And so, sure, I agree that investing in trade education, because we have a need for service providers, and increasingly we will need more service providers as we transition the grid, as we have more electric vehicles, people to perform work and maintenance on those systems is very important. But we still have a cultural privileging of people who obtain four-year degrees and beyond. So that's why many of those people who start out in trade schools then go on to become engineers instead.
do you
Which
think
is a
that,
good thing, because actually, if you're going to have a growing economy in general, and you want to be at the forefront of technology, whether it's alternative forms of energy or anything else, you're going to need to have an educated population to work in those fields. So if you don't have the educated population, the companies that make those things are going to set themselves up elsewhere where they can find people to work.
that's another important thing that you raise. What about unskilled labor? We're getting to the point now where we don't need unskilled labor because we have automation that will do it for us. Look at the Tesla factories.
I try not to.
But that's a brilliant idea. Who should want to do miserable, repetitive, hard work when machines can do that for us, as long as the benefits of that automation gets shared. Right now, it's not shared. It's captured by the entrepreneurs and the people who own the the machines.
I'm currently working on a project that's funded by the National Science Foundation that's studying the kind of mathematics that's required for modern tech-oriented technician jobs or the entry-level jobs, not engineers, but people basically the people on the factory floor who are making the stuff. And while it's true that the workplace has changed a great deal, it really does the troubleshooting of a complicated machine that does stuff that you can't directly observe because it's machining to the nearest millionth of an inch and it's inside a black box and the stuff comes in at this end and it comes out at the other end. And if there's something wrong, you have to figure out what's wrong and do something about it because that machine is very expensive. And if it's offline for a day, the company loses $50 million. They're very different kinds of jobs. And the question of where you learn that is really interesting because it turns out that most of the mathematics that you learn at community college and four-year colleges is not directly relevant to that kind of job. So
I think you bring up a really good, important issue about what the curriculum is too. You can have the best school with the best teachers, and if they're teaching junk curriculum, doesn't matter.
Paul, could you elaborate on what I'm very intrigued by the distinction between the different kind of mathematics that you were talking about.
okay, for example, a good deal of it is driven by the standards, by the tests. And to get into a decent college, you have to score pretty well on things like algebra 2, trigonometry, either calculus or pre-calculus. And what you don't, so being able to, I don't know, factor polynomials or solve quadratic equations and so on, it's not something that anybody ever really does. I mean, I do, I'm a physicist, but most people don't. You know, the last time anybody solved a quadratic equation who isn't a physicist or, you know, an engineer or something, it's not a skill that is directly applicable to anything on the floor. What would be applicable, but is not carefully taught is, and let's take algebra as the example. I don't want to go on and on this way, but in algebra, the typical thing is you solve for X. And so you have this complicated thing and there's an X here and an X there and you manipulate and there are certain rules and you do it right and you get an X equals 7 or whatever. What's not really taught is the ability to look at an equation and read it the way you read music, the way a musician reads music, and recognize that if the pressure goes up and the volume stays the same, then the temperature must, you know, that type of thing, that kind of relationship. And that's really the kind of model thinking, mental model thinking of what is this process? What actually is going on? What are the different factors and how do they interact with one another? And when this goes up, that goes down, but when this goes up a lot, that doesn't go down as much or whatever. That kind of reasoning, that's not the way it's taught. So it's not even a question of the curriculum so much, it's more, you know, the standard thing, I'll quit in a second, but the standard thing that students say is, when am I ever going to use this? Which, by the way, they don't say when you teach them Hamlet. Okay, nobody ever says, when am I going to use Hamlet? In fact, you might use Hamlet. There's lots of ways we can all, as adults, we might think about that, but the student doesn't. But math is really, when am I ever going to solve a quadratic equation? Well, you may never do that, but you will be able to use mental models of of things that you can't directly perceive. That turns out to be really important. So that's a beginning anyway of the kind of thing we're talking about. It's not my lecture, so I'm going to quit at this point.
Thank you.
In the book, you must be joking, Mr. Feynman. It struck me how what he was teaching with physics and science is ways of thinking and problem solving, not rote anything, I guess.
Yeah.
And
No,
that's what we need. A lot more word problems, cross-disciplinary word problems. Because boy, can you use math if you're trying to figure out economic things.
No. Mhm.
And boy, can you use psychology.
Sure.
Behavioral economics, that's cutting edge now, wouldn't you say? Arvind.
Yeah, I have a brief question for Bruce. Thanks, Bruce. It was a great lecture. I was really, I mean, it was completely new information, especially the correlation between the stratification of general wealth versus universities. It was something I suspected for a long time, and you can also draw the parallel with large corporations. I think that may be something that I would explore after this meeting. Just like rising wealth of the 1%, that I think you can draw a line between corporations as well. Same way, the difference between the top 1%, 20% of corporations versus the bottom 80%. But anyway, I think it's intrinsic to capitalism. So my question is that, in your last slide, you said that the top 1% or the top 20% of the universities did not cause this financial meltdown, or of the problem of financial debt of the college students, because but I still, I mean, you specifically clarified it saying this is a common misconception, but that's not what we're saying. But I seem to still kind of think you are saying that, because let me explain my reasoning. I think you mentioned that the list prices of the top universities have risen because they can afford it, and they can also afford to subsidize a higher percentage. So the list price can go up without it affecting the quality of the students that they enroll, because there's enough rich kids with still good academic scores that want to get into these elite universities. Now the bottom 80% has to kind of play this game. It's like an arms race that, the bottom 80% cannot be left out of. So they also have to raise their list prices, but because they cannot attract good quality students, they have to discount their tuition, and that starts to erode the quality of education they offer, and that starts to erode the job prospects of these students who attend these bottom 80% colleges. And then the debt starts to spiral. Let's say you graduated in 2008, then you're stuck for the first 3 or 4 years before you find a job, and then but your debt is due. The moment you graduate, the clock starts ticking, and your debt starts to grow bigger and bigger. So I'm just pointing out that I think your talk clearly demonstrates to me that the competition is being driven from the top by the top 1% and the richest universities with the largest endowments, even though that is not their intention. They're just competing in the American capitalistic way of trying to get better and better, and and they can keep raising their prices because they can afford to get away with it, which I think is driving this arms race and kind of causing this loan situation that we currently have right now. I don't know. That's the conclusion I drew from this kind of reasoning and what you said in the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Arvind. That's a very astute point. It was funny. It was only when I wrote this lecture that I actually added that wealth advantage about the elite institutions driving the tuition. I mean, I had known that and written about that, but I hadn't thought of it in terms of the wealth advantages I was listing. So my thinking is still developing in that regard. The tricky thing about your argument is that the tuition increases driven by the wealthy elite institutions, I think, have little effect on many, probably the majority of colleges and universities, public, particularly state colleges, community colleges. I mean, they don't really care what Princeton and Harvard set for tuition. So there's a kind of, as you go down the hierarchy, so to speak, among the 3,300 college universities, there's a lessening influence of this tuition increase. So I think that's the way I would save my argument in response to your very, very astute. Okay, so now on the other hand, in other words, it's probably the top 20% that own, what did I say, 99% of the endowment. Those are the ones, and particularly the private institutions, that are most responsive to the Stanfords and Princetons, whatnot, raising their tuition. So And those institutions are not the ones where most of the student burdensome, most of the students come from who are burdened with debt that they can't repay, as I said. Most of the students burdened with debt that they can't repay come from the, I'll say lower, less endowed, unendowed institutions that don't have the resources to help them that much. So I take your point. I think it's very astute that the tuition increases of the elites would seem to make this connection about increasing burdensome debt. But I think with those two provisos, that as you go down the ranks, number one, they are less responsive to the tuition increases of the elites. And number two, that the top 20% is not where the students with burdensome debt come from. Probably, I guess, mitigate the point that you're making, the causal impact that you're making. Nevertheless, I have to think more about that because I think, as I said, it was a very astute.
But just a quick
Please.
follow-up.
Yes.
I just mentioned tuition list price increases, but you mentioned in your speech as well that it's not restricted. The competition, the field of competition, the dimensions of competition is not restricted just to tuition. It's also now encompassing recreational facilities, glitzy new buildings, research allocation. I would also add, for example, high visibility superstar professors, for example, so universities throw down lots of money to find a professor who's, a hot icon, like a Nobel laureate, or someone who's got a popular science book, or who's, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, or some kind of, that kind of an evangelist, a tech or a science or some evangelist, and they're willing to throw millions of dollars in salaries for the top 1% of the professors. So isn't that also a kind of arms race? That's I think maybe I didn't voice it as such, but even the state universities, if they want to compete for talent, they have to build these glitzy sports stadiums. They have to have these cool labs, robotics labs, and startup
Coach salaries, coaches.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just saying that, when we just talk about list prices, your point is taken that, the state universities do not really care what Harvard or Princeton does. But if Harvard builds a brand new stadium, doesn't University of Massachusetts have to respond, or they risk losing even more talent to Harvard and Princeton? So I'm just saying that if you expand the dimensions of competition,
Yes.
I would argue it still it ups the ante. And again, this is just capitalism at its finest. It's not like intentional that they're trying to do this.
Right.
But I would argue just trying to answer my own question rather than putting it on the spot. I would argue that the financial conundrum is caused by the disconnect between what the universities are teaching and what the job market really wants and is willing to pay for that premium of, you spending $100,000 in college debt. Does that really translate to a 30% higher productivity compared to a non-college graduate who can do the same work? I think we have a shortage of those kinds of jobs. And, outside of tech or finance, those kind of jobs are very, very limited. So I think where we have hundreds of thousands of graduates coming from other professions and other fields like arts and, humanities or business, and they're not able to match up to the job market, I think I would argue that is where the disconnect lies, and that is what causes people to fall through the cracks. And like you said, it's mostly the lower socioeconomic backgrounds who fall into this crack because they cannot afford to wait 3 or 4 years and get their dream job. If they're not able to start repaying the loans quick, they just get a job at Burger King and go from there. And that limits their ability to get back into their chosen field, because if 4 years you've worked in Burger King, there's no way a law firm is going to hire you after 4 years, even if the economy picks up, when they can pick and choose from the recent graduates of last year or the year before. So they just fall off the grid, so to speak. And I think that would also be a good way to good area to explore and research if that is possible as a solution or an answer.
Well, to go back to the issue of the dimensions of competition, I guess I would say the same things I said before about the tuition. I mean, yes, the University of Massachusetts might respond as you've said, but that's the flagship public university in Massachusetts. And I don't think they're, Framingham State University is not hiring star professors for millions of dollars, and I suspect not building palatial recreation centers. My sister is a business professor at Greenfield Community College. She would be delighted to know that they're hiring star professors out there, but they aren't. So as you go down the hierarchy, I still think, I appreciate what you're saying about the expansion of dimensions of competition. I think that's a great point, but I still think it probably applies only to about the top 20% of the 3,300 colleges and universities. And again, I think you made a great point. I'll have to think more about it, but I think that's my initial response, and I think that there's it's pretty sound. I'm sorry, folks, I have to excuse myself. This has been lovely. I actually have another appointment at 9 o'clock, and we're about 5 minutes from there. So you are very rich and informed group, and I really appreciated the opportunity to speak to you and appreciate your responsiveness. But I'm afraid I do have to excuse myself, if that's okay.
Thank you,
very
Professor
much.
Thank
Kimball.
you.
Okay.
you.
Take care.
Bye-bye, thanks.
Bye-bye.